For those of you that weren't here last week, I had the privilege of being here last week as well as Pastor Joel and his wife Verona. I think they're at a conference this weekend. But we talked last week about Jacob as the prodigal father, and it was Father's Day and seemed appropriate, and we're going to talk about one of his sons. I'm calling him the profitable son, Joseph. Joseph was named by his mother, Rachel, and back then, Jacob in particular had two wives, Leah and Rachel, and then two concubines, the maids of those two wives. When I hear the word concubine, I remember in college there was a girl from Omaha, and she asked, she's a big city girl, Omaha. She asked us what were the name of those machines out in the field that cut the grain. We said, oh, they're concubines. And then she went around telling her friend, talking about concubines to her friends, and finally she figured out that we were playing a joke on her. But anyway, so there's these four wives, that Jacob's got, and his wife Rachel was the one that he really loved, and she wasn't able to have a child. So finally, she is able to have a child. In Genesis 30 verses 22, it says that God remembered Rachel, and she named her son Joseph, and that's the son we're going to talk about. The name Joseph means may he add. So in other words, she says, I'm glad I got a son, but I want another one. And the interesting thing about Joseph is everywhere he went, it was profitable to whoever he served. He always made things better, no matter what it was. So we're going to look at him. Last week we're going to do this again if you weren't here, and this is a reminder if you were, the Old Testament story. And if you could put those slides up, I'd appreciate it. I don't know if you remember, I asked you last week how many books are in the Old Testament. Does anybody remember? We said there's 3 letters in the word Old and 9 letters in the word Testament. There's 39 books in the Old Testament. So of those 39 books, there's 11 books. They are Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. If you just read those 11 books, that's the story of the Old Testament. And then there are 6 other books that are books of history: Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Job, that all occur. Go ahead and go to the next slide there. They all are history books, but they don't really have the story in them. They kind of come along with the story. They're kind of backstory to the main story that comes out in those first 11 books. So, for example, Job happens in during the book of Genesis, which covers thousands of years, so we don't know exactly when that occurred. Ruth happens during the book of Judges. We're not sure which judge she was alive during that, because those judges reigned from, an average about 40 years. So we're not sure when that was exactly. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles parallel 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So those go with that. And then Ezra and Nehemiah are there at the end. So those books. And then lastly, there's 22 other books. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And those are books of poetry and prophecy. So in the first book, Genesis, we talked about there's 4 events. There's the creation, the fall, the flood, and the tower. And then there's the 4 main people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we're going to we looked at Jacob last week. We looked at Joseph. I was here last week with my wife and my granddaughter, and we got to look at one of those main events was the flood. We got to go to last week we were in Williamstown, Kentucky, which is where the Ark Encounter has been built. I don't know if you've heard about it, but we had a great experience going there and looking at, how they think possibly the Ark may have been built. And it was really enlightening. So if you ever get a chance to go there, I'd encourage you to check it out. I'm going to read from a passage in Acts 7. This is Stephen when he's talking to the Jewish leaders after he's become a believer. He's a deacon in the early church, And God is working through him so powerfully that they don't like it because of the things that he's saying. And so he goes to explain to them by doing an overview of the Old Testament, and he talks about Joseph. So let's look at this here. It's Acts chapter 7, 9 through 16. It says, "And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him out of all of his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now there came a famine throughout all Egypt and Canaan, and a great affliction, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on their first visit. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob his father and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, and he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem." So that's a real tight flyover of the story. We're going to go down into it quite a lot deeper. In 2008, during the Beijing Olympics, the 4x100 meter women's team and the 4x100 meter men's team for the United States were slated to win the gold. They were the fastest. But neither one of them got the gold. Do you know why? Has anybody ever run a relay race? I got a baton here. Between the third and the fourth runners, I don't know if you remember this, they dropped that baton. And if you ever run in a relay, this is the most dangerous time, is when you're passing the baton from one runner to another runner. Transitions are dangerous. And we're going to look at Joseph's life and how he went through a multiplicity of transitions over and over and over again. And Joseph did not drop the baton. And if you think the course of our lives, all of us go through transitions. I don't know, maybe some of you have recently graduated from high school. Or maybe you're moving from middle school to high school. There's always some big changes that go on. Or maybe you've just gotten married or engaged, or maybe you just had your first grandchild or your first child. There's all these different life transitions that you go through. And how do we handle those transitions of life? Transitions are exciting too, because they're the places of greatest growth, because we have to adapt and change. We're going to look at Joseph's life because he had some drastic transitions. He's the most talked about person in the book of Genesis. 1/3 of the verses in the book of Genesis are about Joseph. So let's look at why we get told this story of Joseph. And then looking at Joseph, we're going to see how God uses transition in his life and how he uses transition in our lives. So I'm going to start out in Genesis 37. Now Joseph, I'll give you a little background here. Joseph had 10 older brothers. By the time he came along, he had 10 older brothers, and he had one brother after him, so one younger brother, but 10 older brothers. So starting out in chapter 7, verse 1, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. And then it starts talking about Joseph. Well, he's got 10 older brothers. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Does anybody like tattletales? I don't think so. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Wow, that'd be kind of rough. Not necessarily Joseph's fault, but he got treated a certain way. If you look back in the story, we looked at a little bit last week at Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob and now Joseph. Every one of those families had a favorite son, and it created jealousy on down the line every time. And now we've got, with the other ones, it was like 1 versus 1. Now it's 1 versus 10 older brothers. It goes on, it says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your brother and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept a saying in mind. Now Joseph here, he's 17, and he's got one of two problems. He's either arrogant or he's naive. I mean, I'm the oldest brother, so maybe I don't know what this feels like, but I just can't imagine having 10 older brothers and saying, psst, you're going to bow down to me and think you're going to get away with it. They think there's not going to be a response. He was either naive or arrogant or maybe a combination. I don't know. The story goes on. Verse 12, it says, his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, that's Jacob, Israel, his new name, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So his father sends him to go check on what's going on. He obviously hadn't gone with them. They are out working. He's checking on them. He goes out and they see him coming. He can't find them at first. He asks somebody, finds out where they're at, and goes out, and they see him coming. In verse 18, they see him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Things have gotten really bad. Here comes this dreamer. You've heard of the I Have a Dream speech, right? Martin Luther King. That went over way better than what Joseph's I Have a Dream speech was. And his brothers are responding to it. It says, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And they will say that a fierce animal has devoured him. We'll see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben's the firstborn, heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Reuben planned to let him go and get him back to his father. For some reason, Reuben has to go off. And while he's gone, Judah comes up with his idea, well, we don't need to kill him. Here's some Midianite traders going by. Let's sell him to them. We can make a little money and he'll go off. We don't need to kill him. And it goes down later and it says, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers. The boy is gone. Where shall I go? What will I do with this? And they told Reuben that they'd sold him. They took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured Joseph and is without doubt torn to pieces. So these 10 brothers concoct a lie and tell their father this lie. And Jacob is heartbroken. All of his sons and all his daughters tried to comfort him, but they could not. So we have this situation. It says in the last verse in chapter 37, meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Something I see happening here with Joseph is God uses transition to discipline Joseph. Hebrews 12 says God disciplines those he loves. Joseph's heart wasn't quite right in his parents' house. And God used this very difficult thing to work in Joseph's life. It's a test of being forsaken by his brothers. And through the test, Joseph learns intimacy with God, because as he gets sold into slavery, the only person that he still knows is God. He doesn't know anybody else when he moves to this new situation. I can remember a number of years ago when I went overseas to Japan as a short-term missionary, and I got there and I realized the only person I knew when I got there was God. I didn't know anybody else there. I had to meet him and get to know him and all that sort of thing. It wasn't as bad as what Joseph went through, but it's still pretty lonely when you land in a place, you don't speak the language, you don't know what the customs are, and the only person you know is God. And it was only in the morning when I would get up and read my Bible that I felt a little bit at home. This is where Joseph sat. The only person he knows is God. It develops intimacy with God. Joseph at the beginning somehow thought that God had given him these dreams because he was so great and God was blessing his story. But that's not where Joseph ends up. Is my life my story, or is my life God's story? So through that discipline, Joseph developed intimacy with God. Well, now he gets into a new situation. We start out in chapter 39. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. So here's Joseph, a profitable one, who is bringing profit to Potiphar, who purchased him as a slave. It says in verse 6, he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. God used this transition in Joseph's life to disciple him. He learned how to take responsibility and be responsible for someone else's possessions. But the story goes on. In verse 9, starting at the end of verse 6, it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife, Potiphar's wife, cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this wickedness and sin against God? So we talked about the test of being forsaken. Now it's the test of the forbidden. And Joseph says, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? This is the test of the forbidden, and it shows Joseph's integrity before God. He's got this intimacy with God, and he knows that God is watching his life. And there's nobody else there to keep him accountable. There's no fellow believer in Jehovah God that would say, Joseph, you shouldn't do that. He just knew he shouldn't. And he said no. And what happens as the story turns out is Joseph tries to stay away from this woman. In one situation, there's no one in the house, and she grabs him and requests her request again, and he runs away. And then she accuses him of trying to attack her. And Potiphar hears the story and sends him to prison. And in verse 19 it says, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Do you know who the person who was in charge of the prison? The captain of the guard. That's Potiphar. So Potiphar was in charge of the prison, and he sent Joseph to prison. Now, for attacking someone's wife, especially when you have that kind of altitude or that kind of leadership that Potiphar had, he probably should have just had Joseph killed. I don't think he believed his wife. I think he said, I got to go along with this. It just socially wouldn't go if I'd believed a slave over my wife. So he put him in prison, which was unfair because Joseph hadn't done anything. In fact, he'd been very responsible to Potiphar. I don't know that for a fact, but it just seems like he would probably have him exterminated, and he didn't. Because here's what happens. In verse 21, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." This is probably someone working right under Potiphar. "And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Here he's a profitable son again. He said, "I didn't do anything wrong, but whatever you give me to do, Lord, I'm going to do to the best of my ability." I would submit to you that was the best run prison in all of the Mideast. Sometimes when you get knocked around in life unfairly, it's easy to quit. It's easy not to do your best in the next situation. Or when you try for something and you don't get it, and then you have to go on without getting it. It's hard to have those kinds of things happen. But Joseph was faithful in Pharaoh's house. And God blessed him. God blessed what he was doing. God used transition to disciple Joseph. Even when it cost him, he was faithful. Story goes on as Joseph is in the prison. In chapter 40, verse 1, it says, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt." So the cupbearer was the person that tasted the wine to make sure the wine wasn't poisoned, that Pharaoh would drink. And the baker obviously baked the king's food. And it says, "Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard," that again is Potiphar, "in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them." So this is Potiphar appointing Joseph to watch over these two guys that are from the Pharaoh's court. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker, the kings of Egypt. The king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each had his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And both men tell their dream to Joseph. And Joseph, Please notice here, he says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" He doesn't say, "I can help you." He says, God can help you. God can tell you what the interpretation is. He's giving glory to God. Now, all of a sudden, the story is switching. It's not about Joseph, it's about God. This has been beginning to happen through the transitions that are going on in his life. So he gives an interpretation to the cupbearer. He gives an interpretation to the baker. To the cupbearer, he says, "In 3 days you're going to be released. You've been found not guilty." To the baker, he says, "In 3 days you're going to be hanged. You've been found guilty." And Joseph, he speaks to the cupbearer, and he says, "Now when you get back in your position, would you speak to the Pharaoh for me, please?" Says in verse 20 in chapter 40, "On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants." So he pulled them out of prison. "He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them." Now here's this. "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." God uses transition to develop Joseph. It's the test of being forgotten. He's been forsaken. He's had the temptation of the forbidden, and now he's forgotten. This is where Joseph develops identity from God. He has to know who he is before God. He's faithful in the prison. He's faithful to the keeper of the jail. He's faithful to Potiphar. He's faithful to both of these men, and he tells them the truth, exactly what's in their dreams. He was faithful to interpret. So in his parents' house, he struggles. In Potiphar's house, he struggles. In the prison house, he struggles, but he continues to be faithful. Let's move on in the story. So starting out in chapter 41, verse 1, it says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. 2 years. That's a long time. He stays faithful. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. He dreams a dream much like the first, only with different pictures. Pharaoh goes to all of his wise men. He says, someone interpret these 2 dreams for me. And it says there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. I don't have a good memory. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him up out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there's no one can interpret it. I have heard it said that that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered to Pharaoh, now hear this again, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. I can't do it, but God can do it, and tell me about it. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold in my dream, and he gives him his 2 dreams. Down in verse 25, Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land. By reason of the famine that will follow, it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream mean that the thing is fixed by God, and God will surely bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning as wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. This is the 3rd time this has happened to Joseph. He becomes second in command, but he's really in command. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set over you all the land of Egypt. God uses transition to deploy us, to put us in a place where we didn't even think we would go. Joseph has gone from the bottom of Egypt to the top of Egypt in one day. Amazing. Pharaoh's dream. The cupbearer remembers Joseph. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream and tells him what to do in light of it with the wisdom that God gives him, and he rises to power. The test of fortune from God. The other three tests were like negative things: being forsaken, the forbidden, and being forgotten. This is a very positive thing. A number of years ago, I was talking with a friend from Africa, and I was telling him about how my wife and I lost a baby in 1993. And he said, "Bob, I don't want to foreshadow your story or go over the top of your story, but my mother lost 10 babies before I lived." It's like, wow. He said, "I found that there's 3 big tests in life." He says, one of them is trial. Joseph definitely had that. So another one is suffering. Trial is kind of outside. It's what happened with Potiphar's wife. It's what happened that he's sent to prison. And then there's suffering, which is more internal. It's what happened when his brothers sold him into slavery, how that hurt him on the inside. He says, but the third test is the most insidious. It's the biggest, toughest test. And I'm like, trial, suffering, what's left? He said, success. Success. In the Proverbs it says, the fire for silver, the furnace for gold, but a man is tested by the praise that he receives. Why did God take Joseph through all that? So he was ready for this test. So think about the people that have hurt Joseph all along the way. Wouldn't it be tempting to be second in command and be able to do whatever you want and say, hey, why don't you bring Potiphar's wife in and we'll have a talk? How about bringing Potiphar in and having a talk? But he doesn't do that. How about bringing the cupbearer in and say, you forgot me for 2 years? He doesn't do that. That's a challenge. He got tested by his elevation, and he didn't use it to be ugly. He doesn't punish. He leads through 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. He causes the people to save and to prepare for the benefit of many people, not just the Egyptian people, but all the countries around that were in famine as well. The last step that God uses in this process is, I think, in a lot of ways, the toughest one. So it goes on from 42 to the rest through chapter 50 to tell this whole story. But his brothers and his father live outside of Egypt, obviously. But they go through a famine too, and they run out of food. They say, well, we heard that there's food in Egypt. And so Jacob sends his 10 older sons to Egypt to get some food for the family. And they go there and they come before Joseph. And keep in mind, Joseph it's probably 13 years since they saw him last. He was 17, now he's 30. So he's matured. And he's not dressed like someone from their tribe. He's dressed like an Egyptian. He's second to Pharaoh. You ever seen some of the old movies with Egyptian pharaohs in them? That's probably what Joseph looks like. So they don't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them. And when they come before him, he kind of treats them kind of harshly. And I know as I've gone through and studied this in the past, I'm like, what is going on with Joseph? It seems like, he didn't go after Potiphar. He didn't go after Potiphar's wife. He didn't go after the cupbearer. But when his brothers come, he kind of treats them harshly. And they start talking about what they're going through. He says, oh, you're spies. You come to spy out the land. And they start talking to each other. And they say, why are we going through this trial? And they say, it's because of what we did to our brother. They're feeling guilt and shame over what they did to Joseph. And they don't know. They're talking in Hebrew, and Joseph is their brother, and he understands Hebrew. They think they can just talk and not understand. That nobody Egyptian would understand them, but Joseph understands everything they're saying. It's like when I was in Japan for 2.5 years. I learned Japanese. I've been around Japanese for it and heard them talking. One time I was walking down the street, and this little kids were walking behind me, and they were talking behind me, and I turned around in Japanese. I said to them, "Be careful, I speak Japanese." And they went, "Ah!" and ran away. And that's where Joseph was at. He understood what they were saying. And it says that when he heard them talking and saying it was because of the wrong we did to our brother, Joseph had to excuse himself, and he went in the back and he wept. He wept. That somehow the Holy Spirit had put it on the hearts of his brothers that they were in the wrong. 13 years. I believe Joseph been praying for his brothers. God, would you speak to them? Would you move in their hearts to let them see what they've done is wrong? Would you get them right with you? So he supplies them with the grain they need, and he sends them home, and he says, but you can't come back unless you bring your other brother that you told me about. So I'm not sure if I believe you. And just to make sure you will come back, I'm going to keep one of your brothers here. And he keeps Simeon, who is the second born of the brothers. He's probably the one that gave Joseph the hardest time. It wasn't Reuben, the firstborn. Reuben was trying to save him. Second born, second oldest, the one that's probably in command over the whole situation. And I'm sure the other brothers went, how did he, they're all around the same age. So he's going, how did he know he was the second born? He's the one that was the most guilty with Joseph. Why did he keep him back? They're probably wondering about that. So they go home, they take all the food they get, they open their sacks, and all the money they brought is in the sack. They're like, oh boy, we are in big trouble. He's going to think we stole the money if we ever go back. So they get back there, they eat up all the food. Jacob wants to send them back again to get some more food. And Jacob, they say, Father, we can't go back unless we take the youngest, unless we take Benjamin. He won't receive us if we don't bring Benjamin, who is Joseph's full brother. Jacob says, I've lost Joseph, I've lost Simeon. We have to eat. Take him. So they go back. And they go before Joseph. He sees Benjamin. And then he has a banquet for all the brothers. And everybody gets a big portion, but Benjamin gets twice as much as any of the brothers, because this is Joseph's full brother, his little brother. And so this story goes on. He puts them through another test. He sends them back again. And he gives them the money back again. But they plant his cup in Benjamin's sack. And after they're on the way home, some Egyptians come and say, one of you stole the cup. We're going to find him, we're going to take him back. So they look in every sack. And they look in Benjamin's sack, and the cup is there. They say, we're taking him back. Another son of Rachel. See, Joseph wants to find out, are they jealous of the other son of Rachel? So they bring them all back. It says it's him and Judah, their son, Jacob's son Judah. He says, he's going to go to jail. And Judah says, no, don't send him to jail. Send me to jail. Take me, not Benjamin. Do you know what tribe Jesus comes from? The tribe of Judah. We just sang some great gospel songs. Our Savior's from the tribe of Judah. Because Judah said, don't take him, take me. Is that what our Savior did? He took a penalty we deserved. I've always wondered, why in the tribe of Judah? Why not the tribe of Joseph? Because Judah acted out the gospel. And he was chosen, and from his tribe came every king of Israel, was from Judah's tribe. And when he said that, take me, Joseph couldn't take it anymore. He just broke down and wept. He said, I am Joseph, your brother. And immediately they were afraid. And he grabbed them and he hugged them and he held them. He said, I'm here for you. And he loved them. This is the test of forgiveness. That's really hard. Because when we forgive, we have to take everything that's happened to us and take it ourselves and let the person go. And that's what Joseph did. I mean, I've been hurt by some people. Nobody's ever sold me into slavery and wanted me dead. Man, what an example Joseph is. And you know what's really hard is a lot of times those are in our family relationships, just like it was here. Just found out yesterday that two women that were great friends, for some reason they're at odds with each other and haven't talked to each other in a long time. And the one woman today, this morning, her husband's having major brain surgery, and she needs that other woman. I'm not trying to judge him. I've struggled with forgiveness in my life too. But man, a friend of mine says forgiveness is like nailing one of your feet in the past, or bitterness. I mean, bitterness is like nailing one of your feet in the past. You're just stuck to it. And Joseph says, I'm not going to be stuck to what you did to me. I'm going to let you go. And I'm with you, brothers and sisters. We got to forgive. Bitterness is the only poison that you prepare for somebody else that you drink yourself. It really hurts us. And Joseph let it go. There's weeping and there's joy. God used transition to deepen Joseph. And I'm going to skip to chapter 50. Because what happens in chapter 50 is, this, we read about this earlier, but what happens is Joseph has them go get Jacob and the rest of the family and bring them to Egypt, and they live in Egypt. About 75 of them, it said when we read. And we looked at last week in chapter 48 and 49 how Jacob blessed his sons at the end of his life, and then he dies. And then in chapter 50, there's Jacob's funeral. And then starting out in verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke of him. Why did Joseph weep? I think he wept because his brothers didn't believe that he'd forgiven them. They thought, the only reason he's not doing something to us is because Father's still alive. And now that Father's dead, we're in big trouble. It says in verse 18, his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear. Am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me." Joseph doesn't pretend like this never happened. That's not what forgiveness is. It never happened. No, it happened. But he forgave them for it. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Is it possible that in life, when people hurt us deeply, that mean evil against us, that God at the same moment can mean it for good? That's what Joseph is saying. That's powerful. Am I in the place of God, he says? I'm not in control. God's in control. And he has something bigger. And this is what he says, that many people may be kept alive as they are today. And I was meditating about this verse, and he doesn't say, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for my good. He doesn't say that. He says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for the good of others. Wow. That's surrendering to God's story. It's not about Joseph anymore. It's what story is God telling, and what do you want to take me through to tell your story, God? That's even surrendering the difficulty of life and saying, if you want to use the difficulty of my life to tell your story, I'm going to surrender to that. That's tough. That's where Joseph got to. So he says in verse 21, do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Then in the rest of the chapter, we hear about Joseph's death. Joseph was a profitable son. So the question is, what about us? God wants to use transition in our lives to discipline us, to develop us, to deploy us, to deepen us, and to disciple us. Will we be profitable sons and daughters like Joseph? So as the baton is passed, it will be passed to future generations. Jacob, we looked at last week, changed from being a taker to a giver. Joseph changed from being self-focused to God-focused. By God's grace, we can be changed in the same way as well. I have something with me if you're interested. I could give this to you later, but it's a chart that talks about the transitions of life through the different decades of life. And then it compares them to what Joseph went through, and it's interesting how they compare. It was put together by a friend of mine a number of years ago. So this is Jacob's life as the prodigal father. And we remember last week we said prodigal can mean spending wildly in a negative way, or it can mean giving extravagantly. And that's the kind of person that Jacob became. And then with Joseph, he was the profitable son. And he blessed us all. God used Joseph to preserve the Jewish people. And that's where our Savior comes from. So each of us should be grateful to Joseph.